So I want to talk about the paper in quite a broad sense to get us started. So we know that this is Love Through the Ages. So I think it's really important not to lose sight of that because in terms of, work that are essays that I've marked recently, some of them can start to just get a bit bogged down in the plot and a bit bogged down maybe even in like, looking at it as a tragedy, and they can forget that everything has to be dragged back to love through the ages and the fact that this is a paper that's going to require you through various sections, 3 different sections, to consider how these pieces of art deal with love. And love, of course, is a famously hard thing to define. We've got all sorts of different types of love. I won't write them all down, but we've obviously got romantic love. We've got more kind of like, non-romantic, platonic, fraternal, etc. Within that as well, you've got like familial love. You've got all these ideas of like sex and desire. You've got as well ideas of like healthy love versus maybe like unrequited. I shouldn't put slash, I should put V. Unrequited love or obsession. For anyone who's wondering today how on earth this works, by the way, I'm going to be talking at you. You'll be taking notes, and then I will leave some time right at the end for questions. You've also got marriage, of course, discussions of kind of marriage and how that's presented. I think as well, courtship and kind of, wooing and all the sort of various things that go along with that. So that's just a sort of, a handful. I'm sure you've all had a chance to look on the AQA website and gone through, the spec on there. If you haven't yet, definitely do that. And if you are thinking, how on earth do I revise? The mark schemes, the spec on the AQA website, all of those things are great places to start. And it just means that you need to, I'm not saying put these in when they're not relevant, but just make sure every point you make is really pulled back to this. Othello is a really interesting one because, of course, we're dealing with here what some people like to call, or can be called, a domestic tragedy. You might hear it called as well. So one sec, sometimes hard to type and talk. Domestic tragedy or revenge tragedy. What do we mean by domestic tragedy? It means that the tragedy sort of revolves around, domestic events, basically, doesn't it? It revolves around private events. None of this is about kind of, I don't know, actual war or, protecting the crown or, political ambition. I suppose with the Argo, it's a little bit about political ambition, but, it's not about that with Othello, I mean. The whole kind of, rise and fall of his life, or the rise of his life concerns the political, the fall of his life concerns the private. I think that's quite a nice way to sort of word that potentially. And of course, what does it center around? It centers around the sort of very fast failure of his marriage. I can't remember how many days, actual days, the play is supposed to span, but it is only days, I believe, that they're actually in Cyprus. So it's a rather short marriage. And if you remember in Act 2, they are very sort of loved up. They're very happy to see one another in Cyprus. Othello misses essentially a party that evening because they are consummating their marriage. They are very kind of connected. And then just one act later, he absolutely hates her. And we're going to talk about, a few reasons basically why that kind of is. So yeah, this is a domestic tragedy. We have got, the complete neutralization quite early on in the play of any political external threat. So I have put the assessment objectives down there to the side. I will get through these quite quickly because I understand it's not the most thrilling thing in the world, but I also don't feel like I'd be doing my job this morning if I didn't address them in any way, because we all love to discuss, you know, the kind of key debates here. We love to plan essays. That's the fun bit of literature. But, you know, it's very possible to sort of stop progressing or to, you know, sort of plateau if you are just planning, writing, but you're not really thinking about what you're doing in the sense of, you know, these are the assessment objectives and this is what I should be going for. I've looked at these with a few students recently who weren't really kind of aware of their weightings. You know, I had a student recently who said, oh, I usually just bring in a bit of context to the introduction and then I just sort of leave it. And this was a student who was a bit confused why my marks aren't actually improving each week. And that's obviously a major reason, isn't it? This is the blueprint. This is exactly what your teachers, your future examiners are using to mark your work. So AO1 is all about just kind of writing well, the quality of your argument, whether you're able to pick good quotes for the point that you are making. It's going to be about your accuracy when it comes to the other assessment objectives. If I say something is dramatic irony and it's not, that will kind of inadvertently affect my AO1. For instance, if I bring in context that is, you know, pretty inaccurate as well, that affects AO1. So it's pretty far ranging. It affects the entire essay. You can't like separate it in any way, basically. It's very much woven in. Think of it that way. AO2, and I think one of you was in my session yesterday and I was stressing the importance of this, and I will stress the importance again. AO2, it's really important that we remember this is a play. You will be given an extract with this question and you will not have any choice. You will not be given 2 extracts to choose from. You'll be given just 1 extract. And it's really important that we remember to analyze the things that might not even be there in that extract. And I know that's a bit of a tricky concept, but for instance, you know, I think we all know by now that Othello is a bit light on the ground with stage directions. It won't always give you a nice big chunk of stage directions to tell you what's happening, who's doing what, who's wearing what time of day is it. You have to kind of know that going into the exam, don't you? So you have to have the confidence to know the play really well so that when you do get, you know, an extract from it, you can visualize, okay, I pretty much remember who's in this scene and what's happening and blah, blah, blah. They will tell you where the extract is taken from. And I am definitely going to give you tips and tricks today so that you don't feel like if you get a bad extract, you will panic, because that's what we don't want. We never, ever want to panic. It doesn't help anyone. So AO1, 28%. So obviously that's quite a lot. AO2 is about a quarter. So don't slack on that. I noticed that students, once they do start to sort of, you know, turn their attention towards these assessment objectives, AO4 and 5, sometimes, you know, something so foundational, something so, you know, familiar, for instance, at GCSE can start to take a hit. You know, we feel almost a bit like, you know, we feel like we're regressing if we talk about metaphors suddenly. And, you know, yes, you would be if you only talked about metaphors. But AO2 is so much more than that. You know, it's not just language. It is so much more than that. And what you have with Shakespeare actually is a lovely opportunity to almost deal with 2 forms of literature at once, because yes, it's a play. Yes, it's performed on a stage. So you've got loads to talk about there already to do with methods, you know, stage directions, light, sounds, props, etc. But you've also got that added element of it being poetry. So if you ever thought, why is Shakespeare so difficult to read? It's because it's actually a play written in poems, essentially, isn't it? So yeah, when it comes to AO2, I'll write down some examples there of what I'm talking about. So AO2 is, of course, yeah, the language. So that is your metaphors, hyperbole, tone, semantic fields, religious imagery, imperatives. It's also things to do with sounds, entrances and exits, which also links into stage directions, props, any kind of moment of comic relief. You could also say notable staging choices, how sort of busy or loaded the stage is. Is it a sort of like busy social scene in the street, for instance, or a private domestic scene? Of course, it's good to be able to pick out things like, you know, monologues versus soliloquies as well, etc. So really, really important to lean into everything that makes this a play. Do not analyze it as if it is a novel. And just because you are, most of you, doing the Love Through the Ages paper, do remember that that is what makes the part C, I think it is, isn't it? That's what makes that a little bit fiddly. And that's why some students don't like it, because you have to switch between, some of you have to switch between poetry and prose. And it's really important to show that you can make that switch and you don't just start blending them and talking about them as if they're the same, you know, form of literature. You need to be using all your sort of poemy terms, understanding that it's meant to be heard. Poetry is supposed to be heard. Then you need to switch to using, you know, terms that relate more to novels and prose. Here, we need to take in the fact that, or we need to show an appreciation of the fact that a play is watched. It is actually seen and performed live for a live audience. That's the best way it is experienced, not off a page, but on the stage. So language, form, and then also structure. Of course, this is a 5-act classical Aristotelian tragedy. Very wordy there, but that is what it is by definition. So of course, when we think about structure, I think some people think structure still means like sentence forms and use of punctuation. When I use the term structure here, I'm talking about structure in a zoomed out way, essentially. How the play starts, what happens, what kind of, you know, problems are introduced, and how it ends. Why am I going through all of these? It's because obviously so many of you will grasp the plot. So many of you will know what your opinions are when you're given your, you know, sort of debate to engage with. So many of you know how to analyze an extract, but you might not be seeing yourselves in band 5 every single week. So I want to make sure that you know what the sort of roadmap is, let's say, to get there. And a lot of it is stuff like this. This is what's going to make you stand out, essentially, because not all the candidates are doing it. So if there's something really good that the examiner loves, and you know that not all your classmates or all the other candidates are going to do it, it's even more of a reason, isn't it, for you to go for it. Now, when it comes to context, I think students get a bit intimidated by context. So I'll go over this and then I'll take a break from the assessment objectives. AO3 could be anything like attitudes towards marriage, sex, things like that. Of course, this also then brings in religious contexts, so the context of like Christianity. Some of you will have more of a foundational knowledge of things like Christianity than others. You know, some people are taught it in religious education, some of you go to faith school, some of you don't. And I would say if you don't feel like you know really anything about, you know, Christian attitudes towards sex and marriage, etc., it's always worth just doing a little bit of extra research there, because I do know that that sort of understanding is going to vary a bit. So yeah, it's really important that this idea that, you know, Desdemona is presented as a very virtuous woman, that's all tied into religion, even though it might not be said explicitly. She is very much presented as a kind of idealized Christian woman, I suppose. There's a little bit of the rebel in her, though. There's a little bit of the Eve, I suppose, if we use that sort of Christian allusion to Eve from, you know, the fall of man from Genesis. There's a little bit of her obviously pushing and transgressing boundaries, but ultimately, you know, she's not really an Eve at all. Context, we've got in general attitudes towards marriage and sex. We could also bring in the military context and just the idea of like the patriarchy, essentially, and how it is very much upheld by men almost colluding with one another. We see how important it is, don't we? These male bonds, these male friendships. You might have heard this term before, homo-social bonds. Nothing to do with homosexuality or homoerotic. Homosocial bonds, relates to the way that men kind of, through a sort of unspoken, I suppose, like code of behaviors and norms, they have, bonds with one another essentially. So a large part of this seems to be in Othello, specifically in this play, not in Othello the character. A large part of this seems to be a sort of banding up against women. I notice in this play there just seems to be this tension right from the beginning, doesn't there? Of, men and women just not really getting on very well. You've got Desdemona and her break from her father. You've got, I guess Iago's sort of little like debate, and I don't know, it's not an argument, it's just a playful debate, but he has one with Amelia and Desdemona where he says the whole like, you rise to play and go to bed to work thing. You've got obviously Amelia's private thoughts about marriage and men, we are but food and they are but stomachs or something. I think I'm misquoting that, but I'm sure you all remember it. And then, of course, we only have two married couples, and they both end in femicide, in the murder of the wife. Sorry if my cursor's in the way there. So yeah, homosocial bonds are really, really important, even more so in this play because it is a military play. It concerns military men. And also, even with men who aren't in the military. So Rodrigo, if you ever thought he's a soldier, he's not. He's actually just like a sort of wealthy courtier gentleman. Even he, when he has a sort of problem that concerns women, he turns to a man, doesn't he? It doesn't feel like many of them have sort of strong female figures or friends in their lives. It feels very much like women are in one category, and then men are your friends, they're your confidants, they're your brothers in war. And I think this play is really critical of that separation, essentially, because it stops, doesn't it, ultimately, the men being able to appreciate the women as friends, as human beings. So I'll stop there for now with the assessment objectives. Of course, I know I haven't gone over AO4 and 5, but I'm going to come back to them because I want to now introduce our extract for today. And it does link to everything I've been saying already. So if you've all been furiously scribbling down, I'll just put myself in the face. If you've been scribbling down your notes, then yeah, you'll find that everything we've been talking about already could start to filter into this extract. Now, you are given an extract and you are given a question and neither of which you will really be able to prepare for fully. So what I mean by that is it doesn't just say analyze this extract in relation to the literature of love. It will always give you actually a specific character or theme or whatever. So really, really important for everyone. Of course, this is obvious advice, but really, really important to know your play very, very well. And to think about what you can be doing to sort of make sure that you do. Do you need to reread it at some point? Do you need to rewatch an adaptation? Don't think of these things as something you do at once and then you're like, oh, phew, that's done now. Think of it as something that you can do multiple times, and each time it's going to be even more helpful than the last. So I wrote this question myself. I'm not saying it's the most original question, but I do think it is pretty important. And the first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to do some analysis that doesn't revolve around the extract at all. So I really want you to make sure that you analyze your question before you even start to read the extract, before you even start to, think about that. Because I think if you just go straight in with the extract, obviously you're in an exam, you want to know what extract you got, there's going to be that temptation just to quickly read it and start annotating. That can be really, really wasteful time-wise, actually. Why? Well, because you might start, picking out things you don't need and making a mess of your extract, essentially. Whereas if you think about the key debate and you start to almost sort of plan out there and then what you might be looking for in the extract, it allows you to go in a much cleaner way where you will be just picking out what you need. And that's really key, isn't it? So I've said in Othello, Shakespeare presents his audience with a damning portrait of marriage. In light of this view, discuss how Shakespeare presents marriage in this extract and elsewhere in the play. So, really, really, really key debate here. And I think I would also recommend all of you to have a bit more of an understanding of Shakespeare's other plays as well. You know, because we are very light on the ground in terms of getting to know Shakespeare personally, aside from his plays. You know, he didn't leave a lot behind in terms of like letters or journal entries or anything. It's really impossible actually to know him and what his beliefs were aside from studying his plays. And of course, his plays are really enigmatic, aren't they? We can't really come down on any, one view. So I would say if you want to know Shakespeare, if you want to truly know his attitudes towards marriage, it might be worth looking into the plots, for instance, of one of his comedies. Because if we just say throughout, oh, well, yeah, marriage is super negative in this play, so therefore Shakespeare was against it, then we're just kind of going down a really sort of, an interesting blinkered route, aren't we? That doesn't take into account the fact that many of his other plays end with the happy ending of characters marrying. So that's the first thing I want to say here. Shakespeare is not anti-marriage necessarily, but it's just that we have a unique play here where there are only two marriages presented to us on stage, and both of them end in murder. Murder at the hands of the husbands. So, just remember, this is what, being in the top band is all about, is being really careful with your wording, careful not to just argue one way. And that's what hopefully I'm going to show you today as well, because you might look at this and panic and think like, how on earth do I find the other side? I've been given a question that relates to, is this basically really critical of marriage? And I've been given a scene that shows, one husband's just killed his wife and one's trying to, he's stabbing at her. How on earth do I find another side here? But don't panic. You can always find another side, and I'm going to show you how. So the first thing we want to think about is this idea of it being a damning portrait. It leaves very little room in the question itself for another view. So in light of this view, discuss. We've got our very classically A-level-y word there, don't we? Discuss, explore. It says in light of this view, so we know that we can't just ignore that and talk about whatever we want to talk about. We know that we need to bring that in, and we know that it's a discussion. They haven't asked us to prove that necessarily. They haven't said, okay, now go into the play and find everywhere where marriage is presented as terrible. They've said discuss it. And of course, a high level response is very unlikely to just go one way, isn't it? Why is that? Is it because it's more interesting for the examiner to read? Not only, it's actually because it helps you to hit the assessment objectives. And I didn't touch on 5 yet, but so many candidates just think of AO5 as being critics. Like, oh, that's just critics. I have to bring in critics. AO5, you can even, touch on or get marks for just by showing an awareness of other views. So even just by sort of saying like, however, a Jacobean audience may have responded with X, or by saying a feminist critic would certainly respond to this with Y. So yeah, even that is AO5. So really, really, really important. A lot of candidates who aren't getting into the 20s consistently are just basically sacrificing at the moment a few of these marks, AO4 and AO5. So yeah, I want to give you a chance now, all of you, to read the extract. And I want you to think about, before you annotate, I want you to think about, where was this taken from? Well, I'll tell you now, it's from Act 5, Scene 2, which is the final scene. We are hurtling towards the resolution in terms of our tragic arc. I want you to think about, what does this scene seem to suggest about marriage specifically? Because I suppose, when it comes to showing an awareness of another side, it's not just yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and constantly contradicting yourself. It's just that you might sort of provide a bit of a qualification. You might say yes, this play does provide a pretty damning portrait of marriage. However, it's not marriage that's the problem, it's the patriarchy. However, it's not marriage that's actually the problem, it's the kind of, the culture of male vanity and pride and, anxieties surrounding female sexuality. So, is it critical of marriage, actual marriage, or, and then I'll just write down what I was saying then. So, yes, have a read over this now. And then I am going to sort of annotate it with you so that you'll be able to hopefully add to some of your ideas. I don't know how everyone's taking notes today, but if you're trying to find this in your play, obviously that's a good place to go. But even if you just have a blank piece of paper or a blank document, you can still just bullet point your notes. Okay, so don't worry if you haven't got down everything that you would have wished to get down. You can sort of carry on annotating as we're going through this. The first thing that I would want to pick out, I'm kind of going against my own rules here because I do always say you don't need to go through things chronologically. And in your writing, you certainly won't, because that could lead to you just accidentally narrating the extract, telling your examiner what's happening in it, which isn't really what you want to actually do. But I'm just going to start just because obviously it's easier. I'm going to go through this from the top. The first thing that does stand out to me is, we've got Othello standing by what he's done. He's standing by what he's done, literally standing. We've even got a nice stage direction there, standing. What does that show? It shows he feels kind of vindicated in what he's done. He's literally standing up for himself. She was foul. I scarce did know you, uncle. There lies your niece. There lies your niece. He's still proudly standing by what he's done at this point. Whose breath indeed these hands have newly stopped. I know this act shows horrible and grim. By saying I know this act shows horrible and grim, it infers, doesn't it, that he thinks that, yes, okay, it looks bad, but it had to be done. It was a necessary evil. It's something I'm willing to stand by. To Britannia, who obviously, represents kind of Venetian law and order, doesn't he? So what does this show us about marriage? It shows that marriage endows the husband with a rather dangerous sense of kind of their own personal justice and control and dominion. Once Desdemona ceased to be Brabantio's daughter and became Othello's wife, she then ultimately, her life seems to become a piece of sort of disposable property to him, doesn't it? And of course, we can say, well, he wasn't always like that. It was due to Iago's manipulations, blah, blah, blah. And that's going to be a major thing we bring in here. But, yeah, he basically is led to believe that destroying Desdemona for threatening him, for threatening his image, for threatening his role as a commander, he's led to believe that that is a natural and just proportionate response, isn't he? And ultimately, what social institution does underpin that? I would say you can argue it's marriage. Look at the kind of the marriage vows. The woman is or was traditionally what did they say? Something about honor and obey, and then I think lots of women choose to sort of change that now, don't they? Because it does strike us as being rather archaic. But that is certainly a long way away during the Jacobean era, during the Renaissance, isn't it? We know that Desdemona takes her role as a wife, being quite synonymous with being dutiful, with being obedient. She even says that to her own father. And I think it's interesting that, Brabantio is mentioned here. He's a little bit forgotten about in this play, but Britannia says, poor Desdemona, I'm glad thy father's dead. Thy match was mortal to him. Meaning, this marriage already killed him, pure grief shore his old thread in twain. Did he live now, this sight would make him do a desperate turn. So, it's basically saying it's better that he died before rather than obviously seeing what was going to happen. And even just the fact thy match was mortal to him, I think we can't talk about marriage in this era without talking about the fact that it was essentially a transference, wasn't it, of kind of patriarchal control from the father to the new husband. And what does that end up sort of doing here? Is it safer for, women to stay under the patriarchal control of their fathers? What is it about marriage that seems to be particularly kind of emotionally heightened and dangerous in this play? Because you've got a perfect juxtaposition there, don't you? Brabantio almost allows himself to be sacrificed. He allows Desdemona to sort of go off. He accepts that he was defeated. He accepts her will, and he dies. It's almost like that's a perfect example, isn't it, of a father's love. And he kind of dies off stage, whatever, due to the kind of injury that her revolt has done to him. So in a way, that's quite sacrificial. However, when it comes to Othello, when it comes to the fact she's married a powerful military man, who's he choosing to sacrifice? He sacrifices her to save himself, doesn't he? So this is where this idea becomes really complicated because, is it a damning portrait of marriage, or is that a damning portrait of, Othello's pride? And the way that, no matter who comes up against him, whether it's a wife or a friend, he will slay them down to sort of, protect himself. And we do see that earlier in the play, don't we? We do actually see that in Act 2. He says, whoever stirs next dies upon his motion. That's when he comes to break up the fight. So I also then want to think about obviously the interaction between Emilia and Iago here. So Emilia speaks out. She revolts against her husband. She certainly doesn't believe in this instance that it's morally right to stand by him, protect him. She says, oh God, oh heavenly God. That's her realizing her part in this whole thing was to steal the handkerchief. And Iago says, zounds, hold your peace, meaning shut up. He draws his sword. Be wise and get you home. And he draws his sword as a threat there. So really important. Notice how I'm always thinking about the physical nature of what's happening. I pointed out the stage direction of Othello standing. I could also bring in a bit of like my knowledge of what's going on already. I could also say that actually it's usually shown that Desdemona's dead during this entire scene. She actually stays on the bed, dead in the background. And I think that's really powerful even as well, isn't it? And that's something that's not in the extract said explicitly, perhaps, but if I have a knowledge of how this looks on a stage, I will know that. So I might want to talk about that. I might want to talk about the symbolism of the marital bed kind of in the background. I think that's called upstage, and then the characters are downstage if they are towards the audience, but don't quote me on that. I'm very sorry. I think it is upstage. But yeah, the symbolism of the marital bed, Desdemona dead in bed, for want of a better phrase, also produces a kind of, I think anyway, quite a physical symbol or metaphor, doesn't it, of the deadly nature of marriage. Especially because earlier in the play, Desdemona had asked, shroud me in my wedding sheets. I feel she felt her death was near at the hands of her husband, and yet she goes to it almost willingly, and certainly willing to protect him, doesn't she? And of course, she's literally suffocated in the marital bed. I mean, the metaphor jumps out there, doesn't it? She could have been anywhere. She could have just been walking around outside and he sort of finds her and strangles her. The fact that it's all in the marriage bed, very deliberate, isn't it? So anyway, going back to this, Iago draws his sword as a very physical threat. And Emilia still says, I will not. That does not instill the fear of death in her at all. She is very happy, isn't she, to sort of almost sacrifice her life at this point for her friend's legacy, honor, whatever, the truth. And even Gritanio says here, fie, your sword upon a woman. It's an exclamation, isn't it, that is not normal. That is breaking with sort of, virtuous, gentlemanly behavior. It's breaking from sort of, courtly, conventions. It's breaking from the very, not even just the vows of marriage, which is all about to honor and protect and to love and to serve, but it's breaking even just from what it is to be a man in this era. To pull your sword upon a woman, especially as a man of military, we can't overstate how shocking that is. She is defenseless. Emilia is a civilian woman. She is not armed. And also, again, just thinking about kind of tropes and gender norms, she's a woman, he's a man. It is completely disproportionate and it's completely shocking to Britannia, who is obviously a Venetian gentleman. So again, linking back to what this whole question was about, which is this a damning portrait of marriage? Do we really think it's fair to say that this is damning marriage when Iago is the husband in question? Iago is a murderer or a murderous person. He is, some say a representative of innate evil. So, of course, any marriage with him is going to be an absolute disaster. And, is it that shocking that he kills his wife and draws his sword on her? Probably not. So, yeah, there's loads we can speak about here. And I also certainly would bring in Emilia's final comment there, which is directed towards Othello. I'm sorry, it actually says that there, doesn't it? So to Othello, oh murderous coxcomb, what should such a fool do with so good a wife? And this obviously links to a scene that I was talking about earlier from Act 4, which is all about kind of Emilia's stance as the sort of hardened, ever suffering wife. So the thing that I want to do today is not to give you all your opinions and give you all your arguments. I want you just to make sure that you're thinking about everything. So I don't want to confuse you all, but I will just say, I think this is really interesting. I was just saying a moment ago that, maybe it's not fair to say that Iago is used to criticize marriage. I think he's just used to criticize sort of human nature, and he is a villain. He's an antagonist. Yes, okay, kills his wife, but does that mean Shakespeare's criticizing the institution of marriage? No, I wouldn't say so anyway. However, if we go backwards in the play a little bit, we know that even before he was drawing his sword on her, Emilia was desperately unhappy. And again, you could say, well, yeah, she's unhappy because she's married to Iago. I think most people would be. But it's that sense of feeling trapped in an unhappy marriage that is really kind of dangerous. And I think that's where we get this sense of, marriage is quite heavily criticized, because marriage is presented in this era, certainly pre, second wave feminism, which doesn't come until the 20th century. It's presented as something which once you're in, you're in. It is not easy to leave. It's not socially acceptable to leave. It's against religion to leave. So that's where we get this whole sort of idea of, how easy it is for a woman's life to become very quickly miserable, to become very quickly bogged down by, verbal, physical abuse. And I think that's also very important as well, isn't it? Othello's first abuse against Desdemona is not strangling her. There was a lot of verbal abuse, calling her a whore and etc. before publicly, which is hugely humiliating and painful for her. And he also hits her again publicly. He strikes her. And, it shows, doesn't it? He goes from being such a different person to obviously being the person who strangles her. And I think in many ways it is a really delicate and also powerful portrayal in that way, isn't it? Of the kind of insidious nature of marital abuse. The idea that someone can play a role in your courtship, get you kind of locked down, get you taken away from your family in this era I'm talking about, but perhaps this is kind of enduring, get you locked down, taken away from your family, and then change. And then change from the person who's, supposed to protect you, love you, to someone who ultimately seeks to destroy you, whether that is a very physical, thinking, what's the word? Destroyment, destroyal. That's not, those aren't words, are they? Whether that's destruction, that's the word. Whether it's a physical destruction in terms of killing you, or whether it's more of a mental, emotional sort of, slow death. I think you could say Desdemona starts to wilt and die far before she actually dies, couldn't you? She's so different, when she's asking Amelia to sort of get her wedding sheets, and she's going to go, slowly to her death. She's so different there to the Desdemona we see in Act One, who advocates for herself publicly, who asks to go to Cyprus, regardless of the fact it's dangerous. She's so strong. He even calls her my fair warrior. Versus now we've just got poor Desdemona, that mark of pity. I want us to also now, I put some little tips at the side. I want you to think about minor characters as well. I mean, think about who could be a nice minor character we bring in here. Perhaps like Bianca, for instance. She is excluded from the marital market, essentially. It's suggested to us. She wants marriage. She loves Cassio, and yet he laughs. He laughs at the very prospect of marrying her. Of course, he has a sexual financial relationship with her, but he would never marry her. And here we've got that whole idea, don't we, of the sort of Madonna whore complex, which is something I want to touch on very briefly, but I will just say, if you haven't heard that before, the Wikipedia page explains it very, very well. Some of you will have come across that, some of you wouldn't, but it's this idea. This isn't something, by the way, Shakespeare would have been aware of. This is hundreds of years later, so don't say that it's an influence on the play in any way. We're applying it retrospectively. But the Madonna whore complex was sort of conceptualized by Freud. It's a theory, which means it can't be proven. It's not necessarily true. But he said that men are predisposed to sort of sorting women into two categories, into saintly Madonnas, which refers to, the sort of religious Madonna. And you can love them as a wife and as a mother, but you cannot desire them. And the whores, so sexually debased women who they are kind of, who they desire sexually, but who they cannot love. So where one enters, where lust sort of, enters, love leaves, and where love enters, lust leaves. And it's, I think really prevalent in this play anyway. As I was just saying, Bianca is very much excluded, isn't she, from the marriage market, whether she knows that or not. But actually, cleverly, that allows her to survive in this play, doesn't it? I mean, what could be a more damning indictment of, is indictment the right word? What could be a more damning portrait of marriage than that? The only woman, there are 3 women in this play. The only one who survives is the one who essentially we're led to believe cannot or will not marry. But then is that too simplistic? Even if she did marry Cassio, I really doubt he has it in him to become murderous. I don't know. I'm not trying to answer any questions for you today. I'm just wanting you to show, just wanting to show you, sorry, how much you can sort of think of this from, different angles, and how full of debate your response should be. Now, I've also just put down some little tips to do with the introduction and also your paragraphs there. The introduction needs to start with acknowledging the extract. So you want to situate it a little bit. You don't need to describe everything that happens in it, but just situate it, explain why it's, an important moment, particularly for the theme or character you've been given. You need to state your opinion, but that comes as a result of laying out both sides. So don't just fall into the trap of thinking that you're going to write a stronger essay, if you just pick one side. That's how my essay is gonna sort of wow them. I'm really going to get my point across if I just pick one side and really just hammer it. No, a strong essay is someone who acknowledges that there might be other plausible arguments, and they can, turn towards them. They're not going to ignore them and run away from them, whilst also showing why their argument is the strongest. In terms of your paragraphs, I've said that you want to stick, I'd say, about 75% with the extract, and then about 25% rest of the play. If that's slightly different to what you've been told, don't panic. If you've been told to do a 50-50 split, for instance, I'm sure that's absolutely fine. These are just the sort of guidelines that I think, work really nicely. And yeah, remembering your assessment objectives. The 25% rest of the play, where you are remembering to go out into the rest of the play. I think the only assessment objective I haven't discussed yet today is AO4, which is all about connections. And that will be where you are bringing in other parts of the play. So if you're thinking, how on earth do I hit that assessment objective in this question? It is literally just where you will be doing your links.